It's my pleasure to welcome you to this evening's inaugural public event, Military Ethics in an Age of Terrorism, Comparative Perspectives. My name is Ari Mermelstein, and I'm the Center's Assistant Director. The Center for Jewish Law has broad aims that encompass the emerging dialogue between Jewish law and secular legal theory, the comparative study of Jewish law and other religious and secular legal traditions, and the contribution of Jewish law to pressing contemporary issues. This evening's panel combines these different dimensions of the Center's activities. In addition to our scholarly programming, we hope to bring these areas of concern to a broader public through public lectures, panels, and conferences. I'd like to thank each of our distinguished panelists for joining us this evening, and I will kick off the event by handing it over to our moderator, Professor Arthur Jacobson of Cardozo Law School. Thank you very much.
Thanks. It's my pleasure to moderate this panel, and to start, I will call upon Daniel Statman, who is a professor of philosophy at Haifa University. His main interests include moral and legal philosophy, moral psychology, and modern Jewish philosophy. Among his other writings, Professor Statman is the author of Moral Dilemmas and the editor of Moral Luck. He was a member of the team that rewrote the ethical code of the Israel Defense Force and has written extensively in the field of military ethics. Danny.
Thank you very much. Good evening. It's an honor and pleasure to be here. The title for this panel is Military Ethics in an Age of Terrorism, not military ethics as it applies to terrorism. And I think whoever picked this title did a good job. Because what we witnessed in the last few years, partly as a result of terrorism, is a re-examination of fundamental assumptions in military ethics. A re-examination whose moral and legal implications might turn out to be quite significant. In my presentation, I'll first try to show why terrorism has led to this re-examination, and then present what I regard to be the most troubling dilemma in the field of military ethics today. A lot of ink has been spilled on the question of how to define terrorism, and too much of it has been political rather than philosophical. In my view, the philosophical question here is that regarding the legitimacy of indiscriminate attacks against the civilian population. Such attacks are almost always viewed by those carrying them out as means to achieve political goals. Sometimes they might be viewed also as ends in themselves, that the killing itself has some value, but that's rarely the case. And even in those cases, it's also a means to some political goals. Thus understood, terrorism belongs to, in the legal and philosophical draw of jus in bello, justice in warfare. To call some policy or organization terrorist says nothing about the goals of the organization, I suggest, but about the methods that are used to attain those goals. If I'm right in this, you can immediately see how misleading it is to present terrorism and freedom fighting as contradictory terms. Since terrorism concerns methods and not goals, then of course one can fight for freedom using terrorism, i.e., making indiscriminate attacks on the enemy population. Also, viewed in this manner, the moral question raised by terrorism applies to states and non-states alike, hence does not privilege powerful and wealthy countries over weak and poor groups who are trying to advance their agenda. If this is so, what then is the challenge created to just war theory by terrorism? As terrorism is on the level of jus in bello, justice in warfare, the challenge is also on that level. It concerns the fundamental assumption of just war theory and of international law, according to which warfare must be limited to combatants. This limitation is two-sided, so to say. It says that only combatants are allowed to open fire in war, and only combatants are legitimate targets of such fire. This applies to both sides, the just and the unjust side. Terrorism challenges both assumptions. Those who take part in the organized violence are not necessarily combatants, certainly not in the sense of officially belonging to some army. And of course, those who are the object of this violence, the targets, are not combatants. I mean, not necessarily so. Attacks on restaurants might kill soldiers who happen to be eating there together with civilians. But why do I say that terrorism challenges this basic assumption of just war theory instead of saying that it simply rejects it? The answer is that some of the arguments offered on both sides in the debate about terrorism seem, at least initially, to make sense, to make some sense. And together, they challenge us to rethink the above assumption. Supporters of terrorism argue that those targeted by terror are not really innocent, but responsible to at least some degree for the aggression carried out by their country or by their collective. The reasons given to substantiate this claim might vary. At the very least, it might be said that in a democracy, civilians are responsible for the acts of their government because they elected it, or because they did not do enough to get rid of it. So either way, all citizens are in some way responsible for what their country does. Opponents of terrorism argue that those who plan, coordinate, or carry out indiscriminate attacks are combatants in the relevant sense, hence could be targeted even if they don't wear uniform and even if they are not official members of any state army. Thus, the double challenge to the accepted status of non-combatants in war. If the terrorists' arguments make sense, then we might have to drop the almost absolute prohibition against targeting civilians. If the arguments of their opponents make sense, we might again widen the category of legitimate targets far beyond those individuals who belong to an organized army. There's another line of argument made by supporters of terror which threatens to undermine the conventions of jus in bello, and that is the argument based on Michael Walzer's notion of supreme emergencies. According to Walzer, when countries stand with their backs to the wall, unable to defend themselves from serious threats against them, they are allowed to use unconventional means if the conventional means don't work. And the unconventional means they would be allowed to use might include torture, might include indiscriminate killing of the innocent. In this vein, it has been argued, for instance, that the Palestinian attacks in Israeli cities were justified in light of the supreme emergency in which the Palestinians found themselves on this argument under Israeli occupation. The problem is that once the notion of supreme emergencies is admitted to this debate, the debate about terrorism, it is very hard to limit its use and maintain the almost absolute prohibition against targeting non-combatants. After all, if to save itself from enslavement and massacre, a collective is allowed to kill thousands of non-combatants on the aggressive side, then surely to save several hundreds, a collective should be allowed to kill several dozen non-combatants. The same reasons, be they utilitarian or non-utilitarian, that might justify massive indiscriminate killing in supreme emergencies, would justify some measure of indiscriminate killing in less critical situations too, thus completely undermining the basic conventions of jus in bello. Once the genie of supreme emergencies is out of the bottle, it is very hard to push it back again. I'm not saying that these questions did not trouble thinkers in the field in the past. But nevertheless, I think that the terrorism of the last decade and the debate around it have been powerful catalysts in bringing about the rethinking and the re-examination of just war theory that we witnessed in recent years. So far, I've talked about how living in an age of terrorism has challenged our thinking about the conventions of warfare. The fresh thinking in this area has revealed a fundamental dilemma in our moral reasoning, a dilemma between individualist and collectivist paradigms of ethics. I would like to devote the remaining part of my talk to demonstrating this point. What I have in mind when I speak of the individualist paradigm is the idea that the moral status of human beings is solely determined by their individual character and behavior. What they owe to others, what others owe to them, ultimately depends on them. If they behave badly, they make themselves vulnerable to negative responses in the form of self-defensive acts or of punishment, while insofar as they behave properly, they maintain immunity, that is moral and legal immunity, from such responses. From this point of view, every time we pose a threat to some individual, we are morally required to explain to this individual why the threat we are threatening is morally justified. We are accountable, or to coin a phrase, we are responsible. We owe a response. That's to be responsible. You owe a response to each and every individual that might be affected by our behavior. That's at the center of the individualist notion. Every individual we might affect, we need to respond to. The individualist paradigm has a strong opposition to luck built into it. What we owe others and what is owed to us ultimately depends on factors which are within our control, hence not a matter of luck. I don't think I need to elaborate more on this paradigm for the simple reason that I think all of us just grew up with this paradigm. I would just say a word about its application to self-defense. In accord with the individualist paradigm, if I want to kill somebody in order to block some threat he poses to me, I need to establish that this particular individual I am thinking of killing in order to block the threat, that this particular person is indeed posing an illegitimate threat to me, that it can be blocked only by killing him, that the killing is proportionate to the evil prevented, and that he is morally responsible for this threat. This individualist paradigm leads to radical implications regarding the morality of warfare. Let me mention two shocking ones. One, if moral responsibility is crucial in determining moral status, including what might be done under the title of self-defense, then there is no reason to think that only combatants of the unjust side might be killed rather than non-combatants, many of whom might actually be more responsible for the unjust war than combatants. Could be politicians, journalists, and many others. Two, the individualist view implies that in principle, each particular case of killing in war, again in principle, each particular case of killing in war must meet the standard condition of self-defense. Thus, in principle, we need to establish that the killing or wounding of each enemy soldier is necessary for the defense of our country. Surprisingly, or maybe not so surprisingly, such a condition is absent in the conditions for use in bello, thus implicitly licensing the unlimited killing of enemy soldiers without having to justify to any particular soldier why we are killing him. If we meet, in heaven or in hell, and the guy said, "Why did they kill me? Why did you have to kill me?" So, on these standard accounts, we don't owe him an answer. The answer would be, it was war. Something like that. While on the individualist paradigm, we are answerable to each person we harm, in war, we are not. The enemy soldiers we kill in war are, so to say, faceless, in sharp contrast to the spirit and conventions of individualist morality. The tension between individualist morality, with its very strict conditions on the use of force in self-defense, and the morality of war can be further illustrated, but for the present purposes, this will be enough. To put it simply, the serious constraints on the use of force in individualist morality and in domestic law don't seem to be compatible with the wholesale killing that takes place in war. One response to this problem would be to try to show that in the final analysis, the morality of war is compatible with individualist morality. I tend to be skeptical as to how far this line of reasoning can take us. Writing in a very similar context, philosopher Jeff McMahon argued that the accepted conventions of just war are indeed incompatible with the correct understanding of the right to self-defense. Nonetheless, we'd better not mess about with these conventions, because the result of such messing about might be even worse. It took many years for the international community to more or less agree on these conventions, so we'd better now stick to them. The problem with this argument is that it leaves those involved in war, as politicians or as soldiers, with a very troubling sense of wrongdoing. A different response to the problem at hand would be to argue that wars cannot be judged only through the prism of individual morality, because they are essentially conflicts between collectives. To make this suggestion work, we'd need to assume the existence of collective entities above and beyond the existence of the individuals that comprise them, and we'd need to develop a morality that takes into consideration this metaphysics. To illustrate briefly the implications of such a collectivist view, let's go back to the issue of supreme emergencies. Suppose that the only way a nation can defend itself from genocide is by using unconventional weapons against its enemy. Terrible means, which would bring about the death of thousands of civilians, but that's the only way the nation can defend itself. For those who accept that in such exceptional circumstances, the use of such measures would be justified, it seems that the only it seems that only some kind of a collectivist morality could do the justificatory work, if any could. The enemy would be bombed because it poses a threat as a collective, not because all of the individuals that comprise the collective are responsible for the threat and hence are morally legitimate targets for attack. Let me conclude. In the last decade or so, there seems to be increasing recognition of the deep tension between individualist morality and the conventions of war. I doubt whether this tension can be eased within the paradigm of individualist morality. If it cannot, then the collective paradigm will have to come into play, a move which might have implications for other parts of morality too. If neither of these paradigms turns out to justify the conventions of war, then pacifism might be the only decent approach to war. But I think very few of us regard it as a real option. That is the dilemma which we face today. Thank you very much.
I'd like to introduce our next speaker on my left, George Fletcher. George is the Cardozo Professor of Jurisprudence at Columbia Law School. He writes and speaks primarily in the fields of criminal law and in the international law of war. His 10th book, The Grammar of Criminal Law, was just published by Oxford University Press. He will soon publish Defending Humanity, When Force is Justified and Why. George, thank you for being here. It's been a pleasure to welcome you.
Thank you, Arthur. Actually, I didn't know what turn I was going to come in. I was hoping to have more time, but you never know when your time has come and you have to stand up and deliver. So I basically am very interested, and I want to explore with you some of the basic distinctions that are used in talking about warfare and killing in the context of warfare. I don't have anything to disagree with about Danny's presentation. I think I'm going to build on it and simply amplify and ruminate about some of the distinctions that we talk about. And it does seem that always the argument is in a binary form. For many years, we've been talking about combatants versus civilians. And let me just ask you to make some assumptions with me, because this may not be familiar territory for everybody. Since World War II, or since really the Geneva Conventions, we have assumed that in the context of warfare, it's permissible without further explanation to kill enemy soldiers, but it's not permissible directly to target civilians. It is acceptable under the law of war to cause incidental damage to civilians by airstrikes against military targets. This is a long accepted idea that is justified along with many other forms of incidental harm. The basic argument is if your intention is to destroy a military target, then a certain amount of collateral damage to civilians is acceptable. The only way that you can commit a war crime in the current era is intentionally or knowingly to target the civilian population. So long as the incidental damage or the collateral damage is more or less proportional, and no one knows what that is, then there is really no serious conversation about liability for a war crime. Take, for example, and I think it's a good example, is the frequent accusation made against Israel last summer for so-called allegedly disproportionate bombing in northern Lebanon. Now, the disproportionate bombing of civilian targets. Assuming that Israel had in all cases civilian targets, military targets, which I assume, then there is a theoretical possibility of liability for war crimes for the collateral damage if it is excessive, disproportionate in comparison to the value of the military target. But you can hear, you don't have to be a lawyer to know how vague these terms are. There is simply nobody who knows what this means. There is nobody who can tell you authoritatively if you're taking out a certain kind of military target, what number of civilian casualties is tolerable as a collateral harm. Therefore, this is an area that is wide open for all sorts of political claims, and there's no doubt that in last summer, in my opinion, there were these political arguments were easily manipulated. The problem is that there's not even a theoretical conversation about the concept of proportionality in warfare. What exactly does it mean? Because there are many different kinds of proportionality. Is it a 50-50 balancing like this, but then you have to put values on both sides? Actually, in the law, disproportionate sometimes means like this, sometimes it means like this. There are many different meanings of the term in legal conversation. And unfortunately, in the law of war, we have made very little progress in trying to clarify this concept. So I think that the possibility of establishing war crimes for attacking the wrong kind of people, even collaterally or incidentally, is, what shall I say? It's a theory to be manipulated if you so choose. But I'm going to avoid that because I don't think it's really a serious topic. What I'm more interested in is the moral significance of the various categories that we use to talk about this problem. It all goes back basically to the distinction between perpetrators and victims. and ultimately between the guilty and the innocent. I think this is what we are ultimately concerned about. Who is guilty, who is innocent, who is the perpetrator, and who is the victim? Actually, as I was making notes, I was thinking, actually, it all goes back to this old joke about how you define the schlemiel. The schlemiel is the person who has the soup spilled upon him. And the other person who is spilling the soup is the perpetrator, and the schlemiel is the victim who is spilt upon. That is the fundamental distinction that operates here. Who is acting and who is suffering? Now, the very interesting concept of the victim requires another word or two, because even though I'm going to go off in different directions, the concept of victims is one of the few areas that has engaged my interest with any, I would say, any conceptual success. The history, and this is an important topic for biblical law, for Jewish law as well, the history and the concept of the korban is fundamental to understanding crime, and it's fundamental to understanding the concept of war and the concept of unlawful war. And one of my fortuitous discoveries, I should say, in my research is that the concept of the korban, as we use it in talking about victims, has a feature that is shared across all languages in the Western world. All languages that are influenced in any way by Judaism, Christianity, or Islam. And that basic feature is that the korban, the victim of a crime or the victim of warfare, is the same as the temple sacrifice. So that there is a connotation, and it's hard to know exactly what the connotation is. There is an association in people's minds between victimhood in the honorific sense that is used in the book of Leviticus, and victimhood in the sense in which we express compassion and pity for those who are the collateral damage, or those who suffer in the course of crime or warfare. Now, let me turn to the subject of killing and the justification for killing. I think in the entire conversation, in the history of discussing justifiable killing, there are three basic lines of argument. One line of thought is you can kill in warfare. You can kill in self-defense. And the licensed executioner of the state is entitled to carry out a death warrant. Now, the interesting difference among these, there's an important difference among these three. In the case of the executioner who is carrying out the death warrant, we don't really care whether this person enjoys his work or not. Some people may be drawn to it, and if they happen to enjoy it, this is not our concern. That's their own personal psychological disposition. In the case of warfare, it's acceptable to enjoy killing the enemy. This is a rather interesting document, a proposition, when you think about it. In warfare, it is acceptable to enjoy killing the enemy. Now, self-defense is critically different from these other two. And self-defense, the significant feature about self-defense is that you are not supposed to enjoy killing the attacker. In fact, if you do, there is something inherently suspect about your using force in self-defense. Under the law, and every criminal code in the world requires this, your purpose must be to avert the attack, not to kill the enemy. but to avert the attack. The death of the enemy brings us back to the theme that we were talking about earlier, collateral damage. The death of the attacker is collateral damage, is a collateral consequence of your intentionally averting the attack. If you do this for the sake of enjoyment, then you are really in a serious moral quandary. I'm just trying to think whether there's anything in the Din Rodef, in Jewish law, that would speak to the contrary. And I don't think there is. But I could stand illumination or questions about this and reflect further about it. I think the basic idea of self-defense, whether we're talking in the context of Jewish law or secular law or Islamic law, is that your purpose is to avert the attack, not to target the enemy for the enemy's sake. You are not supposed to enjoy killing. And indeed, the killing itself is not justifiable. Basically, there are two different acts that are in question. One is the act of averting the attack by using force. That is justifiable. And the other is the consequence to the aggressor, which is the act of killing. The unfortunate consequence of killing the aggressor. That is a distinguishable act and has to be treated differently. Now, in this context, I have been troubled and I still have not resolved the question of targeted assassinations. Actually, I think Danny and I have been arguing about targeted assassinations for years. Before the critical decision by Justice Barak in 2006, and I'm not so sure we've had a chance to discuss it since then. Basically, the question is, how do we classify killings in the circumstances of targeted assassinations against terrorists when we have reliable evidence that the terrorist is armed and headed for a civilian target? This is something that obviously falls between the categories of war and self-defense. And indeed, in trying to justify, or in his, I think, brilliant opinion on the problem of the Chisulim, that Justice Barak argued by invoking a provision from the law of war, that it is permissible to target the assailant, the terrorist, while and so long as the attacker is directly engaged in hostilities. That is, there is a provision in the Geneva, the first protocol to the Geneva Convention in 1977, which Israel did not sign, the United States did not sign, but which is extremely useful for these purposes. And that provision holds that, okay, we have a fundamental distinction between civilians and combatants. We all understand that. But there is a middle category of civilians who are participating in hostilities. And while the civilians are participating in these hostilities, they are vulnerable to attack. It's quite interesting because the implication doesn't work the other way. If you are a member of the military and you go home for the evening, you take off your uniform and you're having dinner with your family, you are still subject to attack. While you are in the military, you are subject to attack. So the fact that you temporarily retire and participate in civilian activities doesn't take you outside the target group. But if you are a civilian and you participate directly in the hostilities by being armed and approaching a target for the purposes of sabotage, then you are at that moment subject to a targeted assassination. The problem I have with the theory is I don't know whether this is part of the law of war or whether the theory is one of self-defense. And indeed, in the borderline cases, this will make a tremendous difference. Because if it is part of the law of war, then the right to attack extends to the potential terrorist while he is sleeping. If it is part of self-defense, it does not extend that far. You can see the difference. The law of war, and here is really what the ultimate difference is. The law of war is a question of status. The law of self-defense is a question of action. The law of war says when you occupy a certain status, you are a combatant. Then you have certain rights and you are subject to certain liabilities by virtue of your possessing that status. The law of self-defense is totally different conceptual structure, and this does not matter whether we're talking collectively or individually. The law of self-defense is about action and the capacity to intervene to prevent potentially harmful action. Thank you. It's almost impossible to merge these two different ways of thinking into one consistent, systematic principle, one based upon status, the other based upon action. There is another interesting category that falls in between the problem of between the status of combatants and civilians. It's worth thinking about it just for a second by comparison. That's the problem of the unlawful combatant. Now, to understand the concept of the combatant, I have to take you back into the legal history of the Hague Conventions for just a second. The combatant is defined by four characteristics. Called a belligerent or a combatant, the terms are interchangeable. This goes back to the Hague Conventions of 1899 and 1907. The four requirements are that there has to be, you cannot be fighting alone. There has to be a chain of command. You have to be part of an organized unit. You have to be wearing a uniform or some other distinctive emblem so that the other side can see you. You can understand that because, well, I'll explain in a second. You have to carry your arms openly. You cannot carry weapons secretly like Bernard Goetz on the subway. And you have to abide by the laws and usages of war, which is a vague fourth criterion, but which sums up the basic general principle that you have to be fighting according to the basic customs and usages of war. Now, the most problems are encountered, and usually the problems are encountered with regard to people who are not wearing uniforms. The big problem is, why does that matter so much? Well, it's obvious why it matters. If someone is approaching us with carrying arms, even carrying arms openly, but is not identified as a soldier, we are not prepared to respond. We don't know how to respond. The wearing of the uniform is a way of admitting responsibility, claiming your capacities as a fighter and as a belligerent, that is the right to kill, but at the same time exposing yourself to the response, that is, that you can be killed upon at sight. Usually in the case of terrorists, what we're talking about is people who probably do not satisfy any of these four requirements except the first, and that's only loosely. There is some kind of chain of command. There is some organized structure. I don't know whether we would use the term terrorist. In fact, there was a general, I don't think we would use the term terrorist to talk about people who are off on crazy diversions of their own. They take up, some people who just go crazy and pick up a gun and start shooting, they are not part of an organization, they're not part of a chain of command. I don't think that we would call these people a terrorist. There is implicit in the idea of a terrorist operation an organized structure or a chain of command. Well, what follows from all of this? What follows is that the categories provide some moral assistance in trying to think our way through these questions. There is more involved than simply whether or not people are taking direct part in hostilities. There are other important questions that have to be asked and answered, such as place in the chain of command, such as general observance of the customs and usages of war, and such as whether or not there is any appearance to the public as a whole of being part of an organized resistance. Ultimately, the problem is one of reciprocity. And if we declare that the situation is a situation of warfare, rather than a situation, see, one of the fundamental differences between self-defense and warfare is that self-defense is a fundamentally unilateral response to danger. There is an unlawful attack, I respond. It's not a bilateral process. Warfare is different. If what Israel did in responding to targeted assassinations by declaring it an act of war and invoking the Geneva Conventions, then Israel also declares itself vulnerable under the law of war. It is no longer appealing to the principle of self-defense, which is a matter of protecting the innocent against unlawful attackers. In the law of war, all actors are gray. All are engaged in a process of violence, and therefore, when you choose, as Israel actually, just as Barak did choose, to go with the paradigm of war, you have to consider the implications of exposure on the other side. I think, in my own opinion, that the implications of exposure on the other side are very serious and very damaging, and I would have second thoughts, but I will leave it at that point. Thank you.
Thank you, George. It's my pleasure now to introduce Sohail Hashmi. He is the Associate Professor of International Relations at Mount Holyoke College. He writes and lectures on Islam, on international relations, and the comparative ethics of war and peace. Professor Hashmi is the editor of Islamic Political Ethics, Civil Society, Pluralism and Conflict, and the author of the forthcoming book, The Islamic Ethics of War and Peace, an interpretive essay with historical references. Sohail, thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Jacobson. Good evening to all of you, ladies and gentlemen. Someone once observed that the word in Hebrew that most Americans can readily recognize is shalom, and the word in Arabic that most Americans can most readily recognize is jihad. There's a great deal of truth to that for a multitude of reasons, but Muslims would frequently follow up on that observation by claiming, as they do frequently, that non-Muslims, and particularly Westerners, have a distorted understanding of this very complex term in Islam, jihad. But if the Muslim reactions to September 11th demonstrate anything, I think, it is that Muslims themselves are often bitterly divided on the understanding of this term, jihad. The vast majority of Muslim scholars and politicians were quick to condemn Al-Qaeda's terrorism in the United States after September 11th, 2001. But many of these same individuals justified and continue to justify Hamas's or Islamic Jihad's terrorism in Israel. These double standards seriously undermine any coherent understanding of the Islamic ethics of war. They stem in part from an amoral position, namely, to put it quite simply, that the ends justify the means. This is a morally untenable position within Islamic ethics and within the Islamic ethics of war and peace in particular. For as in the Western just war tradition, which my colleagues have been discussing to some extent, Muslim ethical debates on war may be divided into two broad, related, but this is the crucial part, morally independent set of criteria. The jus ad bellum, as Danny has already described it, that is, under what circumstances is war justified, and jus in bello, that is, once war has begun, how may the armies fight? How may they justly conduct the war? Well, the jihad tradition began to evolve during the lifetime of the Prophet Muhammad himself. For the first 13 years of his life, that is the major part of his missionary activity as a prophet, while he lived and preached in the town of Mecca, Muhammad refused to engage in any form of violence in response to the opposition and persecution that he and the earliest Muslims faced at the hands of the polytheist Meccans. Jihad during the Meccan period of Islam's development meant purely an inward struggle aimed at morally developing the character of the individual Muslims. With regard to the non-Muslims, the Prophet's response for this first period of his activity was one entirely of non-violent resistance. Now, if the Prophet had died or had been killed while he was in Mecca, it is possible, big historical counterfactual, but nevertheless, it is possible that Islam may have evolved along lines similar to those of early Christianity, as an otherworldly sect devoid of political ambitions in this world. But of course, that didn't happen. For in the year 622, the Prophet and the vast majority of Muslims who were residing in Mecca relocated to the nearby town of Medina. And it is in Medina that the jihad struggle acquired a military or violent aspect for the first time. This development is marked in a number of Quranic verses. The first one on this topic gives permission to Muslims to defend themselves with force if they are attacked by their enemies. A subsequent verse makes such self-defense a requirement for the faithful. Finally, after nearly 8 years of warfare with an array of enemies, the Quran seems to enjoin, in two key verses, a war of conquest against non-Muslims aimed at politically subjugating them and eventually converting them to Islam. But following the Prophet's death in 632, the Islamic State spread rapidly through the military conquest of the Arabian Peninsula, through missionary activity, and through the overthrow of the aging Byzantine and Sassanid empires. At the same time, Muslim scholars began the formulation of the Islamic laws of war, focusing almost exclusively on the Medinan notion of jihad, that is, the military understanding of jihad, while almost entirely neglecting the Meccan period. So what we have come to find in the law books of Islam, I used to make some snide comments about lawyers at this point, but since I'm at a law school, I better not. But what we find in the law books of Islam is that jihad has almost entirely a military connotation. It was left by and large to Islamic mystics, the Sufis, to emphasize its nonviolent spiritual aspects, as in the famous tradition ascribed to the Prophet that once when he returned from a military engagement, he told his followers that they had just left the lesser jihad only to enter the greater jihad, the one waged within one's own soul. In the legal theory that was developed following the death of Muhammad, wars against unbelievers were further subdivided into two categories. The first we could call defensive jihad, because it was basically defensive fighting to repulse enemy aggression against Islamic territory or against Muslim populations, the so-called Darul Islam, the abode of Islam. The second type of jihad is the struggle to expand the Darul Islam, the boundaries of Darul Islam, by reducing the territory of the infidels, which was collectively labeled as the Darul Harb, or the abode of war. Both types of conflict justified killing, according to these early lawyers. Although in the second type, what I would call the expansionist jihad, killing of the enemy was permitted only as the final stage in a hierarchy of options that was to be offered the enemy. First, that they accept Islam or the preaching of Islam in their territory. If they accepted that condition, then no further cause for hostilities was warranted. Second, if they refuse the first option, that they accept Islamic sovereignty and agree to the so-called dhimmi, or protected status, by which they would retain a great deal of their communal authority so long as they didn't challenge the sovereignty of the Islamic State. The third and final option, if they had refused all the previous two options, was that they were to be given fair warning and fought. Now, today, among the vast majority of modern Muslim scholars, the only appropriate type of jihad is held to be the defensive kind. Some contemporary scholars reject completely any expansionist aspect to jihad, arguing that the medieval scholars who had come up with this theory to begin with had misinterpreted the Quran and the Prophet's teachings to justify it centuries ago. Others hold that while it may have been historically justified in the 7th or 8th centuries, the modern division of the world into nation states that agreed to abide by international law has made wars of religion obsolete and morally unjustified. So, after having painted the mainstream jihad tradition in such broad strokes, let me just ask, where do Muslim terrorists in general, and the most notorious group today, Al-Qaeda, where do they fit into this picture? Well, they've been characterized as extremists, lurking on the fringes of Islamic thought. But I would suggest that they are not really all that radical if we are limiting our discussion for the moment purely to jus ad bellum, the justification for war. The stated grievances of the bin Laden network fit a pattern that's quite familiar to students of Islamic radicalism over the past 50, 60 years. In a so-called fatwa, in a statement that claimed to be a religious or legal edict that was released in February of 1998, bin Laden and his supporters specified that their war was a defensive struggle against Americans and their allies who had declared war, quote, on God, his messenger, and Muslims. The so-called crimes and sins, as they put it, perpetrated by the United States were threefold, and by now we're all familiar with this list. First, that the United States had stormed the Arabian Peninsula during the Gulf War, and that the United States continued to occupy the lands of Islam in the holiest of places. The second was that the United States continued a war of annihilation against the people of Iraq. There was no love lost between Al-Qaeda and the regime of Saddam Hussein, but the people of Iraq were mentioned in this statement. And finally, the United States supported the State of Israel and its continued occupation of Jerusalem. The only appropriate response from Muslims, according to this 1998 statement, was to wage a defensive jihad to repulse the aggressors. According to virtually all classical and modern scholars, such a war, unlike the expansionist jihad, Al-Qaeda argued, was a moral obligation incumbent upon all true Muslims. In Danny's discussion, it would have been classified, and it was classified as an individual obligation, not a collective obligation. Well, this list of grievances that I've just read out is certainly not unique to Al-Qaeda. The general complaint that the West is attacking Muslim countries and the goal of fighting the aggressors to compel their armies to move out of all the lands of Islam, defeated and unable to threaten any Muslim, as Al-Qaeda phrased it. We've heard all of this repeatedly before Al-Qaeda emerged on the scene. The notion of jihad that's involved here is not that formed during the period of Arab expansion in the 7th century, or the Ottoman-Turkish expansion of the 15th and 16th centuries. It is rather the one formed over the past 2 centuries as Muslims struggled to answer the expansion of the West. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, the aggressor nations were identified as the British, the French, and the Russians. Since the end of World War II, the United States has increasingly come to occupy this position. And of course, all the more so as it became the guardian of the Persian Gulf during the 1980s and the 1990s. So, ladies and gentlemen, if we accept the fatwa as articulating the ideas that motivate Osama bin Laden and his supporters, and I see no reason to challenge this, then there really is nothing at all remarkable about this group. They selectively quote from the Quran to establish the basis for their defensive jihad, but their motivations appear primarily to be the same sort of anti-imperialism, as we may phrase it, that motivates most radical Islamic groups in the Middle East and indeed in other parts of the world. Where Al-Qaeda departs, where it is unique from other groups, is that it has taken its purported defensive jihad to the United States directly. That is, it is waging its struggle in the far enemy as opposed to the near enemy. Al-Qaeda may view itself as the vanguard of an ideological movement that one day will recreate an Islamic caliphate that stretches from Morocco to Indonesia, or will one day ultimately overturn the societies of the rich and powerful West. But their words and their actions indicate that they are astute enough to realize that this is a remote possibility, and indeed it will require divine intervention. So it's when we move from jus ad bellum to jus in bello, from the ends of war to the means of war, that bin Laden and his supporters quickly move to the fringes of Islamic thought, both historical as well as contemporary. This is because the right conduct of Muslim armies has been an important concern of the jihad tradition from its very origins. In one of the first verses of the Quran enjoining war in self-defense, the Quran states, "And fight in God's cause against those who wage war against you, but do not transgress limits, for God loves not the transgressors." The limits here, the word limits is ambiguous. It could refer to jus ad bellum or jus in bello, but historically, in Islamic jurisprudence, the word limits has been understood primarily to refer to the means of war. The limits have been enumerated by Muslim scholars for centuries by going to examples found in the practice of the Prophet and the first 4 caliphs, who according to the Sunni tradition are the rightly guided caliphs, the ones who were most attuned to Muhammad's teachings. And according to authoritative traditions, whenever the Prophet sent out a military force, he would instruct its commanders to adhere to certain restraints, including giving fair notice of attack and sparing women and children. The Prophet's immediate successors continued this practice, as is indicated by the famous 10 commands of the first caliph, Abu Bakr, who declared, "Do not act treacherously, do not act disloyally, do not act neglectfully. Do not mutilate, do not kill little children or old men or women. Do not cut off the heads of the palm trees or burn them. Do not cut down the fruit trees. Do not slaughter a sheep or a cow or a camel, except for sustenance. You will pass by people who devote their lives in cloisters. Leave them and their devotions alone. You will come upon people who bring you platters in which are various sorts of food. If you eat any of it, mention the name of God over it." Clearly then, the Quran and the actions of the Prophet and his successors establish the broad principles of discrimination in war and proportionality of means. Later jurists devoted considerable attention to elaborating just who qualified for non-combatant immunity and what tactics were permissible with this principle in mind. Modern Muslim scholars have continued to develop these principles. One of the most important recent contributions to this literature comes from the Syrian scholar Wahba Zuhaili, who is one of the most eminent experts on the Islamic laws of war. He interprets the verse on limits that I quoted above as saying the following, quote, "Do not fight anyone unless they fight you first. Fighting is thus justified if you fight the enemy and the enemy fights you in return. It is not justified against anyone who does not fight the Muslims, and it is necessary in this event to make peace with them." Zuhaili and many other Muslim scholars, the majority, clearly rule out the possibility of collective responsibility. That is, that all citizens belonging to a perceived foe are somehow responsible. Simply put, the overwhelming consensus of modern scholars is that Islamic ethics endorses international humanitarian law, including the Geneva Conventions, that makes the deliberate targeting of non-combatants and the terrorizing of civilian populations a war crime. Well, Osama bin Laden and his supporters have a brutally simple answer to international law and indeed to the jihad tradition. Quote, "We do not differentiate between those dressed in military uniforms or civilians. Because the US aggression is affecting Muslim civilians, not just the military, all Americans are targets in this fatwa." So in the name of retaliation and reciprocity, they claim there are no innocents. 2 points need to be made in response. First, Islamic ethics never endorses that in the name of retaliation or reciprocity, any and all tactics are permissible. Once again, bin Laden supporters of Islamic terrorism, selectively quote from such Quranic verses as, "Fight the unbelievers as they fight you," to justify attacking American military and political installations, including, of course, the American embassies in Africa, the USS Cole, and the Pentagon. Bin Laden justified the attacks on the World Trade Center by declaring that all Americans, by virtue of their support for their government, that is because America is a democracy, are complicit in their government's crimes. The Islamic terrorists quote from Quranic verses out of context and completely dismiss other verses enjoining forgiveness over retaliation as the better moral option. The second point, briefly, relates to the specific tactic that is now favored by Islamic militants around the world. That is suicide bombing. Well, I don't have much time to go into this very difficult topic, but suffice it to say that suicide in any form is strongly condemned in Islamic teachings, and it is indeed very rare in Islamic societies. According to one tradition of the Prophet that is germane to the present discussion, even a soldier suffering from mortal wounds from battle, should not deliberately take his own life. Well, of course, one may argue that the line between combat and suicide is often very fine and easily crossed. This certainly may be the case when soldiers of a badly outnumbered and outgunned army are fighting the soldiers of a superior force. Consider, for example, that some Americans anyway, still celebrate as heroic such suicidal ventures as the defense of the Alamo, Pickett's charge at the Battle of Gettysburg, or General Custer's last stand. But in mentioning these cases, I'm not at all suggesting they're analogous to the types of attacks we see conducted by Muslim terrorists, because this is not the line we're talking about in most cases of suicide bombings performed today in the name of jihad, where the targets are innocents, families eating in a pizzeria, or office workers sitting at their desks on the 89th floor of the World Trade Center. This is not jihad. This can only be called murder by suicide. Thank you.
Thank you, Sohail. It's my pleasure to introduce my colleague, Suzanne Last Stone. She is professor of law at Cardozo Law School and director of the Center for Jewish Law and Contemporary Civilization. Professor Stone, who writes and lectures on the intersection of Jewish legal thought and contemporary legal theory, is currently visiting the University of Pennsylvania Law School as the Gruss Professor of Talmudic Civil Law, a chair she previously held at the Harvard Law School. Among her other writings, she is the author of In Pursuit of the Countertext, The Turn to the Jewish Legal Model in Contemporary American Legal Theory, which appeared in the Harvard Law Review. Suzanne.
Thank you, Arthur. So I'm going to try to make my comments relate to those of everyone else. And since I had a little bit of advance notice with respect to what Danny was going to say, it's going to be particularly relevant to the comments that we led off with in the beginning of the panel. And Danny put, I think, a few dilemmas on the table. First of all, he noted that the panel, called Military Ethics in an Age of Terrorism, means that we ought to be focusing on what are the peculiar aspects that terrorism adds to the picture in our thinking, right? In our thinking about war. And of course, that he and George and Sohail, in a different way, both talked a little bit about the very basic dilemma that Western thought has grown by looking at two different paradigms, which it's always sharply contrasted or juggled. One of which is thinking about war, the other of which is thinking about crime. And the problem with terrorism is that it doesn't fit easily into either model. And that becomes our very basic beginning dilemma, right? Is it war? But if so, then what do we do about these non-combatants, civilians? Is it a crime? But if it's crime, how do we then manage the problem of a kind of sliding scale between perpetrators and innocents? And so, as Danny said, what really happens is that this issue opens a very large dilemma. And it's a dilemma about moral reasoning. That is, can we continue to struggle and solve these kinds of problems by looking at them through a prism of individualist moral reasoning, right? And actually, I understand Danny's argument correctly. What he's also saying is that the problem was there all along. really what this did is it just exposed it and brought it to the surface. The problem was there all along, because after all, why leave out civilians? Why this sharp distinction in our old models of war between combatants and civilians if civilians in fact are responsible? The idea of an individualist moral model is the idea that you judge every person in accordance with their actual responsibility. And similarly, why put on the table all the enemies as ripe for aggression, right, if not all of them necessarily need to be harmed? Okay. So now the big question that I have to face is, what on earth does a Jewish legal perspective add to this picture, right? How can it add to this picture? And that's a particularly acute problem to deal with when we think about the history of the halakha and the history of Judaism. That is, right, for nearly 2,000 years, we Jews withdrew from affairs of state, right? And we turned our attention inward. And any discussion that there was about war in particular and affairs of state in general was done primarily from a perspective of theory and lack of power. So the discussion is immensely theoretical. And in addition, because it was theoretical, the kinds of sources that were looked at and developed were sources that really are not usually the stuff of the legal discussion. Right? A looking back on the Bible, biblical commentaries, and a looking back on agadot, that is, narratives that can be found in the Talmud and elsewhere, right? But that are not, in traditional parlance, purely legal sources. The second difficulty is one that's not as evident. That second difficulty is that Jewish law is actually a kind of pluralistic system. That is, it has developed, to some extent, two tracks of law. A legal system that is universal in a sense, which outlines the obligations of everyone, of humanity, which it calls Noahide law, and a particularist legal system which outlines the obligations of Jews. And one very big difficulty, which is beginning to resurface in the culture wars in Israel, is parsing out when the rabbis are speaking about what. Is it universal, or is it particular and aspirational? And that's another dilemma that comes in when we begin to think about how to sort of grapple with a Jewish perspective on the topic of military ethics and terrorism. However, and this is yet another shortcoming but not unique to Jewish law, it too operates with two paradigms. That is a split between the paradigm of crime and self-defense and a paradigm of war. And it too, until very recently, hasn't attempted to merge them. So, what then is its strength? Well, for one thing, certainly, given the state of Israel, this is all radically changed. Reflection on these matters has, of course, burgeoned. That may be, in some sense, yet another dilemma, which is that if we were too far from the discussion, we are now so close to the discussion that it is extremely grounded in day-to-day realities and in political struggles within Israeli society, the kinds of opinions and halachic discussion that is coming out of Israel. But its genuine strength, I think, is in response to the dilemma, the basic dilemma that Danny put on the table. And that is, it has a very long and deep history about thinking about individual versus collective notions, right, of moral reasoning. And so what I want to do is two things. I want to give you just a thumbnail sketch of some early rabbinic approaches to the problem of individual versus collective punishment, right? But of course, we understand that there are all sorts of other forms of collectivity that we might discuss, collective responsibility, collective duty, etc. But I want to focus on the issue of punishment because that's what concerns us when we think about this in terms of responses to terrorism, right? And I also want to then link up this very general kind of rabbinic debate. I want to link it up to the modern contemporary discussion about how to respond to terrorism and this split between war and crime. So we begin with just the mere fact that the Bible itself has, it seems, at least on its face, two models of punishment, individual and collective, right? We can see in Exodus a description of, right, God described as punishing to the third or fourth generation. And we see in Deuteronomy and then later in Jeremiah and Ezekiel a statement that everyone should be punished for his own acts, right? And so there's a tension that's right there from the beginning, one that did not escape the attention of the rabbis, who certainly in many places wish to read the Bible as a coherent document, right, coherently, but which is the rule and which is the exception? Modern biblical scholars have tried to solve this dilemma, and when I look at rabbinic accounts, inner-rabbinic accounts, struggling with this dilemma, I'm actually struck by the fact at how much of the rabbinic responses sort of capture some aspects of the modern biblical accounts, but in their own language. So I'm going to outline 4 different ways of looking at the dilemma that I see in rabbinic sources, and there surely can be many more. One of them is to respond in a way that Danny put on the table very early about this dominance of the individual model of moral reasoning in our lives. And that is to kind of see primitive collectivism. Collectivism is primitive and individualism is a kind of moral progression. And there's a hint of this. If outside biblical scholars say this in terms of the biblical Bible, the rabbis themselves in some ways noted it. They said, look, you know what? The objection to collective punishment is put in the mouth of Moses. And indeed, it's there's a famous midrash that it's one of the 3 corrections that God listened to Moses about and said, okay, Moses, you write this down in Deuteronomy, and it'll be known as Torah Moshe, the law of Moses. A second one is one that the biblical scholar Moshe Greenberg put on the table, which was that if you really looked at the Bible and all the instances of collective punishment there, you actually could discern a very sharp division between those that were related to divine command, broadly speaking, and those that were instructions to the court. The court always has to punish on the basis of an individual notion of responsibility, whereas certain kinds of acts that have to do with God or God's justice may well be collective. We can see hints of this in the rabbinic discussion as well, where the rabbis kind of juxtapose what was, right, Saul's actions. It was terrible that Saul collectively punished the priests in the city of Nov, but it was also terrible that Saul did not initiate, right, that Saul did not fulfill a command to punish, right, the king of Amalek and wipe out everyone. And the difference between them actually is a difference between clear divine command and one that involves human initiative. And we can see that we can see that in many, many places. The third is to expand the notion of the individual in a kind of organic sense. That is, there are debates within the rabbinic sources that perhaps the individualist model can be expanded at its edges to include certain organic collectivities, like the family or the city. This discussion comes up particularly in the discussion of the idolatrous city, and it's a great rabbinic debate. But nonetheless, right, lest you mistake what I'm saying, the rabbis of the Talmud do very frequently ask, right, and what was his sin? Or Tuvia is punished, but Zigud is lashed, as a question. How can that be possible? And the final version that I want to put on the table is one that's a little different from this organic model. And that is a notion that we have 2 different forms of needs. We have social needs, political needs, versus rights of the individual. Right? That those are not the same. In fact, they may be starkly contrasting. And here I'm particularly thinking about material that you can see developed in the medieval sources, and particularly Gerandi, that there's a social form of justice, which may include deterrence and attention to political needs, and there's individual justice. The court must mete out individual justice, right? Whereas the king or the sovereign or the community in some sense, right, is charged with, right, effectuating a certain form of social justice. And we can see a resolution similar to that actually earlier even in the Talmud. I don't have time to do this, but I think that that is an appropriate reading of the famous Aggadic story about King David hanging the sons of Saul when the Gibeonites demanded it of them. The Gibeonites and the people of Israel had a pact one with the other. The Gibeonites claimed that Saul had committed basically genocide against them, and Saul And they come now to David and they say, we want revenge. And David, acting as king, in fact, goes ahead and hangs the sons of Saul, who are portrayed in the Talmud as innocent. And the Talmud itself says it was against the letter of the law. That is, collective punishment in this passage in the Talmud is described as against the letter of the law. Yet the Talmud is at pains to essentially justify David's decision, and it does it on what we might call political, social grounds, right, for the glory of the nation, or even perhaps in something closer to home that is relating to notions that lie behind certain kinds of reprisals, to the idea that some sort of reestablishment of parity between groups by having a form of retribution, even if it's in the nature of reprisals, which are basically chains of wrongdoing, is necessary in order for groups to sometimes reconcile. That is, and that really is the theory of reprisals. The theory of reprisals is actually to end hostility. You commit a wrong, but the end of it, right, is the notion of trying to stop further violations of just war, or in fact to kind of end hostility in some way and enter into peace. Now, having put these models on the table, I want to move from there to what is a more modern approach, because what I think that we see in the modern sources, and others have written about this as well, what I think that we can see in the modern sources is a very interesting thing. It's a kind of blurring of these two formally separated categories. One, the individual model of crime and self-defense, and the second, the model of war, as a way to respond to terrorism. And what has happened is a kind of importation of collective notions into the individual model of self-defense. That's one aspect. The second is simply to describe terrorism as war, right, which also requires a lot of redefinition. So both these things one can see in modern halachic writings. And I'll give you just a few examples, and it's become a very strong and current debate. But I'm thinking here of opinions of both Rabbi Yisraeli and Rabbi Ariel, both of whom, right, developed their reasoning on different grounds. Rabbi Ariel essentially, right, tries to tackle the principle of Rodef. Both of them actually try to tackle the principle of, I'm going to backtrack from that because I think it's more clear if we do it this way. Rabbi Yisraeli actually uses the principle of Rodef, or self-defense. But what he says is an extension of the principle in dramatic ways. The principle of self-defense in Jewish law does not allow the harming of innocents, right? You can only reach the aggressor, and that is it. And it also needs to be imminent danger. If that's so, it's of limited utility to our ordinary situations of terrorism, right? They simply don't fit that model. And so what Rabbi Yisraeli does is go back to some of this more general theoretical discussion about the collective, the town, the family, and the ways in which people support each other as an organic collective. And he talks about the aggressor now in these kind of collective terms, in which the aggressor becomes somebody who is a supporter, right? Someone who merely supports terrorism rather than commits the act. Rabbi Ariel does what might be called the second move, which is in some ways to expand the definition of war and to say that terrorism simply is war. And once we're in a situation of war, war is conceptualized by Rabbi Ariel as essentially collective organic acts of the people, right? That is, one person is representing a collectivity, and that is what war is. And it drags in civilians just as much as combatants. Both of these are playing off a biblical commentary. They are particularly Rabbi Ariel is playing off a commentary of the Maharal on the famous story, right, of the punishment of the people of Shechem, right, after Dinah was raped, right? And the commentators are concerned about this. Why punish the entire, right? Why punish the entire town of Shechem, right, when only the prince acted? And the commentators struggle with the morality of this, and one response of the Maharal in the middle, it earlier response of the Maharal that becomes revived here is the notion that when the prince acted, he acted as a head of state. And as such, it was collectivities squaring off each other. And what we have here is really an instance of war. Now, of course, as I said earlier, what is interesting about this is that the discussion has become very, very different from the kind of technical, confined discussion of legal sources that we often see, right, or that we are used to seeing in Jewish legal reasoning. It is much more expansive by virtue of the situation on the ground, but at the same time, it is also importing into it a kind of philosophical edge that deserves to be looked at a lot more closely in terms of this question of individual versus moral versus collective notions of conceptualizing, right, our theories about terrorism, war, defense, etc. And I want to close by adding two counterpositions to it, because this is only one side that we can see. The two counterpositions are that we have to remember that these kinds of opinions, right, are addressing very particular audiences. They're not the sum total of a Jewish legal perspective on the question of what is the correct response to terrorism and how might war be conceptualized or reconceptualized in an age of terrorism. And the two counter responses I want to point to are, first of all, a genuine and interesting move to incorporate international law standards into the halachic discussion by some individuals. And it's actually a very natural one. There are plenty of Jewish legal doctrines that would suggest the ability to fill what are gaps in Jewish legal thinking with norms from the outside. And the issue then becomes one of trying to understand, right, international law as actually providing either a consensual or real ethic, right, that ought to ground halakha in a situation in which the halakha has not really had a strong history, right, of development and reflection. That's one part. The second is a kind of counter push in terms of trying to understand the very purpose of halakha in Israeli society. And here I think I want to simply cite to something that takes the last model I talked about the notion of the individual versus the collective or the social, and extends it in a far more radical way. There are those who would say that, contrary to what we might think intuitively at first blush, that the very essence of halakha is to protect the rights of the individual, right, and not the collectivity. That is the essence of religion, to be embedded in the rights of the individual. By rights of individual, we don't mean here necessarily 21st modern liberal notions, but we mean attention to the individual as opposed to importing and grounding concepts in kind of romantic notions of a collectivity or romantic notions of the nation. And here I'm thinking about not only Leibowitz, but others who have followed him in this way. And what they are suggesting is that indeed the halakha, as harking back to certain of the rabbinic discussion that I mentioned earlier, that the function of Jewish law in the modern state of Israel here on this issue ought to be a kind of individualist ethical critique that is there as a voice to curb excesses of realpolitik and excesses of nationalism. Not that it should be instantiated, but it should be an important religious voice in the discussion. So, now I'm going to end.
Suzanne, thank you. I'd like to give the panelists a brief time to respond to their co-panelists, and then I'd like there to be time for the audience to be able to ask questions. So I'd like to call on you in the order in which you spoke to see if you have just some very short remarks. Danny?
Two questions, one to Sohail and one to George. When I was listening to you, Sohail, I remember many times I would hear Jews making the same kind of presentation when asked about the Jewish attitude to war, and they would point to very nice sources in the Talmud or wherever, and true, there are those sources. Islam and Judaism are very rich and, old traditions. You can find many things over there. So my question is, since I'm ignorant about this, among not scholars, among fuqaha, the religious, what do you call them in English?
Jurisprudence.
Kind of rabbis, okay? Ulama. Is there a significant voice that condemns indiscriminate killing of the innocent on American ground or on Israeli ground or wherever it is, on the basis of the sources you mentioned or others? To George, we've gone through this several times, but still I don't get you. I mean, it seems that you're happy with this distinction you made a big fuss about between self-defense about behavior and war about status, right? But this, I can't understand this. I mean, how is it, morally speaking, that this human being kind of loses his or her moral immunity because of some status that we lawyers ascribe to them? I mean, think of something within a state, okay? Let's say the students of Cardozo start rioting the streets over here over some issue, okay? So there is some kind of status. They are members of this university. Think of some settlers in some settlement, doing some violence. So they have some status, but still, we wouldn't think that this status transforms their basic moral rights. So how is it that in war this happens, that some individual, by the very membership in some army, his moral status transforms in such a way that he can be killed by the enemy, even if he's very minimally responsible to any of the aggression, even if his causal contribution is very minimal?
George, why don't you answer Danny, and you can add your own remarks.
No, actually, I have a similar question for Sohail, so I'll just pose the question, and then I'll answer this one. The similar question is, and I was puzzled about this during the presentation, exactly what the Islamic conception of nationhood is. And in that connection, what I don't understand exactly is the internal justification for Osama bin Laden's authority. That is, how does he explain to himself or why he has the capacity to speak on behalf of all of Islam? This I don't understand. So he's just another guy. So why does he claim the authority, and how is that structured within the tradition of Islam? Actually, when I write about this, Danny, I actually think that one of the interesting differences between lawyers and philosophers is precisely this question. Like, for some reason, it is a philosophical bias that, just as you expressed it, I don't understand this thing about nationhood. I don't understand how you can be part of a collective. I don't understand how status can matter. I think this is a definite professional bias that comes from liberal individualism in the last couple of centuries. But it hasn't been that way forever, and it wasn't that way traditionally. It's not that way in Jewish law, certainly. But Jewish law the Bible is all about collectives interacting. By virtue of your status, you are a member of one group or another, right? And it is not a great mystery in the history of ideas to think of people being identified according to their status within groups. Now, it is true that it is a great achievement, I think, of Western civilization that we have carved the individual out of the group. And I wouldn't want it any other way. this is fundamental to what it is to believe in the American Bill of Rights. I mean, you have individuals are the supreme value. You do not convict the innocent simply because the individual is a member of a group. On the other hand, the whole international tradition of war and peace is based upon collective interaction. The notion of war is inconceivable without the notion of a collective interaction. Actually, it's quite curious. In the Bible, the first example of war occurs when Abraham, and the first time the word war is used is when Abraham goes after the captors of Lot, and individually, right? And it's used as, the word milchama is used to describe this activity, which I've always found rather puzzling, because there's a recognition here that individuals can go to war. But in the modern sense, I always think of the funny example of Edward Said, goes to the border and starts throwing rocks at Israel and wants to declare war against Israel. But I'm sorry, Edward, you can't do it, right? You need a state. You can't just throw rocks at Israel and declare war. You need something more, right? And so it is fundamental to the way we think about these ideas. And one of the consequences is, of course, that when the collectives are interacting, it means that people are vulnerable by virtue of their status. I don't think it's possible any other way. That is, by virtue of the fact that the armies are... Now, the only problem in the history of war is who exactly is vulnerable in the situation of war. And there's been this historical transition, which we haven't talked about so much, which from the 19th century to the 20th century. In the 19th century, it was very clear that the whole nation went to war. There was no argument about that. When the Romantics had this idea completely, the nation went to war. There's idea of the nation at war dominated all of Romantic thought in Western Europe. In contrast to the Enlightenment idea of individuals. So there is this constant struggle between an Enlightenment conception of the individual and standing out on the basis of individual reason, and the collective drama that was rediscovered. I'm not entirely sure why this happened in 19th century history, why the collective was rediscovered and dug up from the past, why the Romantics went back to ancient Greece, why they went back to the Jews in particular. One of the favorite subjects of the Romantic was to go back. Hamann, the great German Romantic, went back, was fascinated by the story of the Jews. He could not get his mind off of this because of the dramatic representation of the Jews as a collective acting in history. I don't know, does that answer your question? No. No. Tell me what the question is again.
Well, it's now even worse, because you say there are these two traditions, the Enlightenment tradition and the Romantic tradition, right?
Right.
And they are contradictory, right?
Right.
But George Fletcher seems to hold both.
Yes.
So,
depending on the day. No, I think this is a conflict that I think is inherent in the history of ideas. To deny one or to deny the other, I think, is to deny part of our being. We have to live somehow with this contradiction in ourselves.
Okay, about this dialogue, I say next year in Jerusalem.
Okay.
Let's give Sohail a chance.
No, sorry.
Well, Danny, I'm frequently asked the same question you just posed, so I'm ready with an answer. Whenever I speak on this topic, someone in the audience or one of my co-panelists says, "Where's the outrage from Muslims?" Well, I think I alluded to it at the very beginning. There was, I think, genuine shock and outrage and a feeling that something outrageous had taken place on September 11, 2001. There was widespread condemnation of the attacks. Beg your pardon? Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, I think there was, widespread condemnation, and Charles Kurtzman, a scholar at University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill, has actually put together a website, which is, I think, a very good resource that basically chronicles the Muslim response. And you can see there that it is respected scholars from all over the world who took grave exception to what happened on that day, and subsequent events as well. There is this double standard which I mentioned, which undermines the outrage and the condemnations. That is, Israel is always made an exception. The terrorism that takes place in Israel is not received with the same kind of moral outrage. And I, quite honestly, and to put it very bluntly, I think that the Arab-Israeli conflict has morally corrupted Islamic political discourse in a fundamental way. It has led to rampant anti-Semitism, which was not part and parcel of the Islamic tradition. It has led to conspiracy theories. It has led to double standards in the way terrorism is treated. So we don't have time to go into all the reasons why Israel is singled out for less condemnation, less approbation when terrorist attacks take place there and whatnot. But just to indicate to you, I think, this double standard, in 2002, the Organization of the Islamic Conference met in Kuala Lumpur, and the host, the Malaysian leader, Mahathir, introduced a resolution in the OIC condemning all acts of terrorism. That was immediately rejected, primarily by the Arab countries, who said you cannot include the Palestinian actions against Israel as terrorism. So in the end, the resolution basically was a watered-down, ineffectual, weak response to a very sincere and genuine problem that Muslims are confronting today. Now, in response to Professor Fletcher's comment about why bin Laden is taken as an authoritative figure,
why he takes himself.
Why he takes himself, that's probably the more important question. The answer is that, and I think this is where the notion of defensive jihad is so important. He's very careful to stay within a legitimate jurisprudential framework, if you will. I think he's not the real reason or the source of these ideas, these arguments. It's his deputy, Zawahiri, who has much more formal training in Islamic law than bin Laden does. But the reason why they maintain this defensive jihad discourse is because in all the classical sources, if the Muslims are facing an enemy and the accepted leaders or the so-called leaders of the Muslim state or states are not able or they're not willing to respond to the enemy aggression, then the duty to respond to the aggression devolves upon the individual Muslim. So at that point, any Muslim can stand up and say, I am leading the defensive jihad, and it's basically a matter of consensus who follows him and who doesn't. But the expansionist jihad is clearly led by the imam, by the authoritative leader of the community, but that's not the case in defensive jihad. This is a big hole in the classical Islamic theory, and this is a hole that bin Laden has been able to effectively exploit.
Thank you, Suzanne.
I think there's a subtext between us all, among us all, that has to do also with what disciplines we're using to approach our topic, between the political theorist, the philosopher, and the lawyer. And my question actually to Sahil has to do with, my question to Sahil actually has to do with a comment that I frequently hear in the discipline I travel in, which is the legal tradition. And that has to do with what has happened in Islam with respect to the jurisprudential tradition, because that actually has had a very much more minor role to play in modern discussion. And I sometimes hear from, in the circles that I travel in, that it's the kind of the modern dissolution of that tradition, so sort of what happened to the legal tradition in modernity that has actually played a large role in some of the crisis in Islam. And I'm very curious to hear about that, and maybe that will help us to resuscitate law against philosophy.
So, should I answer? Well, what happened, Suzanne, is 1258 happened. The Mongol sacking of Baghdad. That had, not to blame the Mongols for all the ills of present Islamic civilization, but it had definitely a chilling effect in the vibrancy of Islamic intellectual culture. And before 1258, before the 13th century, the dominant intellectual tradition in all Islamic intellectual enterprises was jurisprudence, was law, was the elaboration of Sharia. When the Mongols sacked Baghdad and then proceeded to rule in the name of the Abbasid Caliphate, concern quickly developed that they were corrupting Sharia. So as a result, the Islamic ulama of the time adopted a very conservative ethos to continued interpretation of Sharia. This is in the Sunni tradition. And that has had an extremely chilling and deleterious effect through the centuries in the development of Islamic law, because the ulama have been resistant to fundamentally reassessing what Sharia is. And of course, now we're living in the 21st century, tremendous changes have taken place, and there is still strong resistance to tampering, quote unquote, with Sharia, because Sharia has come to be identified with God's law. Whereas, of course, as we all know as lawyers or as students of law, that it is human beings who decide what is God's law through their interpretations. The Quran is extremely, extremely sparse in terms of direct legal rulings. So the whole edifice of Sharia is a human construct. But today, most Muslims are resistant to it. And international law, issues dealing with politics in general, are the most, I would say, the most obsolete dimensions of Sharia. Muslim states today, going back to the question of nationhood, there's a fundamental question out there. Are the Muslim nation states, some 50 Muslim majority states today, are they legitimate according to Sharia, or are they fundamentally a challenge to the notion of the united Muslim community, which was the ideal for centuries? That question is not on the table because that aspect of Sharia is not being discussed.
Of course, it's always, I mean, the insiders, of course, never admit that it's a human construct. I mean, this is true in every religious tradition.
Well, I'd like to have questions from the audience. Again, I request prayerfully that you be brief.